The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, its fragments catching the afternoon light like fallen tears. Isabella Rothschild stood frozen, her emerald eyes wide with something no one in the mansion had ever seen before. Genuine shock. The 37th butler, nanny, and personal assistant had all crumbled under her calculated cruelty within weeks. But this man, this single father with calloused hands and second-hand clothes, hadn't even flinched when she'd hurled her most vicious insults. Instead, he'd simply swept up the glass, looked her directly in the eyes, and said something that made her world tilt off its axis. Miss, your father's money can't buy you what you're really looking for. The Rothschild mansion occupied 3 acres of prime Manhattan real estate, its limestone facade worth more than most small countries' annual budgets. Inside, every surface screamed wealth. Italian marble floors that cost $200,000 per room, crystal chandeliers worth more than luxury cars, paintings that museums begged to borrow. Richard von Rothschild III had built an empire spanning real estate, technology, and private equity. $800 million in assets, according to Forbes, 0 successful relationships with other human beings, according to anyone who knew him personally. His daughter Isabella had inherited his business acumen and multiplied his emotional dysfunction. At 23, she wielded the family fortune like a medieval weapon, cutting down anyone foolish enough to show genuine care. The staff turnover at the Rothschild estate had become Manhattan legend. 37 domestic employees in 2 years, each one systematically destroyed by a young woman who had perfected psychological warfare into an art form. In his mahogany-paneled study, Richard reviewed termination reports with the weary resignation of a general cataloging battlefield casualties. Miss Henderson, the British nanny with 20 years' experience, had lasted 12 days before Isabella convinced her the house was haunted through elaborate midnight disturbances. Marcus, the personal trainer, made it 3 weeks before Isabella fabricated assault charges that nearly destroyed his career. Catherine Morrison, the Harvard psychologist who'd worked with troubled teens for 15 years, was professionally ruined in 6 weeks through a carefully orchestrated public humiliation. Across from Richard sat his latest hire, secured through a small family agency that specialized in what they euphemistically called challenging placements. James Miller looked exactly like what he was, a man hanging on to middle-class respectability by his fingernails. At 42, his second-hand sport coat had seen better decades. His shoes had been resold twice, and his calloused hands spoke of work that didn't involve board meetings or country club handshakes. His entire monthly salary wouldn't cover one of Isabella's handbags. Richard studied the man's file, noting the details that painted a picture of quiet desperation wrapped in determined dignity. Studio apartment in Queens for $1,800 a month, Honda Civic with 160,000 miles, credit score of 643, not bad enough to disqualify him for employment, but low enough to limit his options significantly. 8-year-old son attending public school PS 108, no mother in the picture. Sir, with respect, I've read the files, James said, his gray eyes steady despite the obvious power imbalance in the room. I understand what I'm walking into. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, worth more than James's annual rent. Do you? Because my daughter doesn't just fire people, Miller. She destroys them. She finds their vulnerabilities and exploits them until they quit. Or worse, until they do something that justifies criminal charges. She's brilliant. She's beautiful. And she's completely without conscience when it comes to people she perceives as beneath her station. The assessment was delivered without emotion. A father describing his daughter with the clinical detachment of a doctor discussing a particularly virulent disease. Richard had long since passed the stage of making excuses for Isabella's behavior or harboring illusions about her capacity for change. James absorbed this information without judgment, his expression remaining neutral. 3 years of single parenthood after his wife's death had taught him that desperate people made desperate choices, and he was in no position to criticize anyone else's survival strategies. What exactly do you need from me? He asked. Survive 1 year. If you can last 1 year in this house without quitting, without having a breakdown, without giving Isabella ammunition to destroy your life, I'll double your salary and provide a recommendation that will get you any security position in the country. The offer was generous enough to suggest how difficult the position truly was. Richard wasn't just hiring security, he was hiring a professional target, someone willing to absorb his daughter's psychological abuse in exchange for financial compensation. And my son, 8 years old, according to your file, lost his mother in a car accident. Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly, the first sign of genuine human emotion he'd shown during the interview. The health insurance through this position is comprehensive. Best pediatric care in the city, educational support if needed. Your boy will be taken care of. James nodded once, sealing a deal that would either provide his family security or destroy what remained of his emotional stability. When do I start? Richard's smile held no warmth. You already have. She's been watching this conversation from the security monitor in the kitchen. Isabella Rothschild descended the grand staircase like a predator in Louboutin, every detail of her appearance calculated for maximum psychological impact. Her dress cost $20,000 and flowed around her like liquid silk. Her emerald necklace, worth more than most people's homes, caught the afternoon light with deliberate precision. She'd learned it early that wealth was only powerful if you knew how to weaponize it, and she'd spent years perfecting the art of intimidation through opulence. "Oh, so you're the latest sacrifice," she said, circling James like a shark who'd caught the scent of blood in the water. Her voice carried the precise diction of a private school education and the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been denied anything. James Miller, age 42, widowed, one child, currently living in a studio apartment in Queens that rents for $1,800 a month. Your credit score is 643. You drive a Honda Civic with 160,000 miles, and your son Tommy attends public school PS 108. The recitation of personal details was designed to establish dominance through invasion of privacy, to remind James that she held all the cards in whatever game they were about to play. Previous employees had responded to this treatment with either desperate attempts at charm or immediate signs of fear, both reactions that fed Isabella's sense of control. James remained seated, neither intimidated nor impressed by her performance. His calm acceptance of her verbal assault seemed to catch Isabella off guard, disrupting the rhythm of intimidation she'd carefully orchestrated. "You've done your homework," he said simply. "I always research my prey." Isabella's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell me, what's your breaking point? Financial pressure? Threats to your employment record? Something involving your son's welfare?" The question was asked with the confident expectation of an answer, as if James's psychological destruction was merely a matter of identifying the correct pressure point and applying sufficient force. "I don't have one," James replied with quiet certainty. The confidence in his voice made Isabella pause mid-circle, her predatory pacing interrupted by genuine surprise. Previous targets had either tried to charm her with false bravado or shown immediate signs of fear that she could exploit. James did neither. He simply sat in his second-hand clothes in her million-dollar study and met her gaze with unshakable composure. "Everyone has a breaking point, Mr. Miller," Isabella said, recovering her momentum. "I have a 100% success rate in finding them. Then I guess we'll see if you can make it 101%. The challenge was issued without aggression or bravado, simply stated as fact. For the first time in her adult life, Isabella found herself facing someone who seemed genuinely unimpressed by her wealth, unmoved by her threats, and uninterested in the psychological games that had defined every relationship she'd ever had. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Isabella's campaign against James began with a deliberately impossible request. She needed breakfast prepared exactly 7 minutes before she came downstairs. Not 6, not 8, but precisely 7 minutes. The timing was calculated to create chaos in the kitchen while giving her grounds to criticize whatever solution the staff improvised. When James arrived to find Maria, the head housekeeper, frantically trying to coordinate the impossible schedule, he simply introduced himself and asked for the basic routine. Maria explained in heavily accented English that there was no routine, that Isabella changed everything daily to keep everyone off balance, that yesterday's preferences would be today's cause for complaint. James absorbed this information without criticism or frustration, then rolled up his sleeves and began working with the kitchen staff to create a system that could handle unexpected demands. When Isabella glided into the dining room, expecting chaos and excuses, she found fresh fruit, perfectly prepared eggs Benedict, and coffee at exactly the temperature she preferred. The efficiency was infuriating because it gave her no legitimate grounds for complaint. When she declared the eggs overcooked, James offered to have them remade. When she criticized the hollandaise as too thick, he thanked her for the feedback and promised to inform the chef. When she claimed the coffee was the wrong temperature, he poured fresh coffee from a thermal carafe without missing a beat. Isabella found herself eating breakfast in a frustrated silence, realizing she'd encountered something unprecedented, an employee who didn't grovel, didn't make excuses, and didn't seem impressed by her performance. Worse, he'd solved her deliberately impossible request without drama or complaint, turning her sabotage into successful household management. Day 2 brought escalation. Isabella rearranged the security schedule James had carefully coordinated, forcing him to work 18-hour shifts while managing a dinner party for 50 guests. When that failed to break his composure, she invited her most demanding friends for an impromptu pool party, then disappeared for the day, leaving James to manage drunk socialites, noise complaints from neighbors, and the complex logistics of an event no one had planned. The party should have been a disaster. Instead, James coordinated with catering staff to relocate the gathering to a nearby venue when it became clear the mansion wasn't equipped for the impromptu celebration. By evening, Isabella's friends were praising her thoughtfulness in arranging alternate accommodations. The neighbors were satisfied by the reduced noise levels, and James was calmly filing incident reports, as if managing chaos was simply part of his normal duties. Isabella returned at midnight, expecting to find her home in ruins and her new employee in crisis. Instead, she found everything immaculate and James reviewing the day's events with the same professional detachment he'd shown since arriving. Isabella's research into James's personal history had provided her with what she considered perfect ammunition. Sarah Miller, age 34, killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver. Devastating personal loss was always exploitable, and grief made people vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Isabella had perfected. During a dinner party for her father's business associates, Isabella began her campaign with surgical precision. She spoke loudly about Manhattan's terrifying traffic, about reckless drivers and people texting while driving, about how amazing it was that anyone survived their daily commute. She discussed a recent accident she'd seen on the news, how one moment someone could be driving home to their family, and the next moment everything could change forever. The attack was designed to reopen wounds that hadn't fully healed, to make James relive his wife's death until the emotional pressure became unbearable. Isabella watched his face carefully for signs of breaking, noting the almost imperceptible tightening of his hand on the wine bottle he was holding, the brief flicker of pain that crossed his features before he composed himself and continued his duties. Over the following days, she pressed the advantage with relentless precision. Comments about car safety were woven into casual conversation. Observations about how quickly life could change appeared during routine discussions about household schedules. Mentions of traffic accidents from news reports became regular features of dinner table conversation. The strategy worked to a point. James grew quieter, his responses more clipped. He began leaving work exactly at his scheduled time instead of staying late to ensure everything was perfect. During one particularly brutal evening, when Isabella had spent 10 minutes discussing a traffic fatality, James excused himself early, claiming he needed to check on Tommy. Isabella watched him go with satisfaction, warming her chest. Finally, she'd found the crack in his armor, the vulnerability that would eventually expand into complete psychological collapse. But James returned the next morning with the same steady professionalism, and the morning after that. Unlike previous employees who either exploded in anger or crumbled into tearful breakdowns when their personal tragedies were exploited, he simply endured. He absorbed her cruelty, acknowledged the hits, and continued functioning at the same level of competence he'd maintained since arriving. Isabella began to realize she was dealing with something unprecedented. James Miller wasn't just professionally competent, he was emotionally bulletproof in a way she'd never encountered. Her usual weapons weren't working because he seemed to possess some internal strength that her attacks couldn't touch. The discovery was both fascinating and infuriating. Isabella had built her entire identity around being the most dangerous person in any room, the ultimate threat that everyone else had to navigate carefully. But what if she wasn't threatening to someone whose primary concerns lay completely outside her sphere of influence? Maria, the head housekeeper who'd watched 15 years of Manhattan wealthy family drama, offered insight when Isabella cornered her in the kitchen one afternoon. When pressed about James's unusual resilience, Maria explained that he had a little boy, Tommy, 8 years old, and when he talked about his son, his entire demeanor changed. That man would walk through fire for his child, Maria observed. And maybe when you have something that important to protect, other people's meanness doesn't seem so significant. The explanation unsettled Isabella more than she cared to admit. She'd never encountered someone whose priority system was so fundamentally different from her own. Someone who measured success and failure based on entirely external criteria that she couldn't influence or control. Isabella's most sophisticated attack yet was a carefully orchestrated situation that would force James to choose between his professional obligations and his personal priorities, then destroy him for whichever choice he made. The opportunity came when Richard's annual charity gala was scheduled for the same evening as Tommy's school performance. Isabella had discovered this conflict through careful research into the public school calendar, and she arranged for the gala's security requirements to demand James's personal oversight throughout the evening. 300 guests, including several high-profile politicians and business leaders, would require the kind of attention that made delegation impossible. When she presented James with the security protocols before the event, she watched his face carefully for signs of the internal conflict she was creating. The folder was deliberately thick with complicated procedures that would justify his constant presence, and she explained with false sympathy that she would need him personally overseeing every aspect from evening until at least midnight. James reviewed the documents with his usual thoroughness, his expression unreadable. When Isabella mentioned the timing conflict with Tommy's performance, she expected excuses, pleading, desperate attempts to negotiate alternative arrangements. Instead, James pulled out his phone and made a simple call. Isabella listened as he explained to his son that he wouldn't be able to attend the performance because of work responsibilities. She heard Tommy's disappointment through the phone and waited for the guilt to overwhelm James's professional composure. Instead, she heard him arrange for Tommy's grandmother to drive down from Albany specifically to attend the performance, to bring the good camera, and to video everything so James could watch it later. The solution was so practical, so focused on Tommy's experience rather than James's guilt, that Isabella found herself genuinely confused. This wasn't how guilt was supposed to work. This wasn't how emotional manipulation was supposed to function. "That's it?" she asked when James hung up. "You're just missing it?" James looked at her directly for the first time in weeks, his gray eyes clear and untroubled. Sometimes being a parent means making sacrifices for your child's security. This job provides Tommy's health insurance, his stability, his future educational opportunities. Missing one performance to protect his long-term welfare isn't a sacrifice. It's responsible parenting. The simple statement hit Isabella like a physical blow, cutting through her cynical worldview with devastating clarity. When had anyone ever sacrificed anything for her benefit? When had love looked like difficult choices instead of easy gestures? When had someone prioritized her security over their own immediate happiness? The charity gala raised $2.8 million for childhood cancer research, a record that would be mentioned in newspaper coverage and society pages for weeks afterward. Isabella played perfect hostess, charming donors, and managing egos with the skill of someone trained from birth for such performances. But throughout the evening, she found herself watching James coordinate security with quiet efficiency. She observed how he treated every staff member with equal respect, regardless of their position in the hierarchy, how he handled multiple crises without drama or complaint, how he maintained the same professional demeanor, whether dealing with billionaire donors or part-time serving staff. There was something fundamentally different about his approach to other people, a baseline of human dignity that he extended universally. During a brief lull between dinner and the auction, Isabella approached him near the main entrance, where he was coordinating with external security teams. "The event is going well," she said, unsure why she felt compelled to acknowledge his competence. "Thank you, miss. Your father should be pleased with tonight's results." Isabella found herself asking a question that had been bothering her all evening. "Do you ever resent having to make choices like tonight, missing Tommy's performance for work?" James was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes thoughtful as he considered how to answer. Miss Rothschild, resentment is what happens when you think you deserve better than what life gives you. I don't deserve anything beyond what I can earn through my work and what I can protect through my choices. Tonight, I earned Tommy's continued security and I protected his future opportunities. That's enough. The philosophy was devastating to Isabella because it contradicted everything she'd been taught about entitlement and expectation. She'd spent her entire life believing she deserved everything she wanted simply by virtue of existing, that the world owed her happiness and satisfaction and immediate gratification of every desire. But what about happiness, she pressed. What about what you want for yourself? What I want is for Tommy to grow up safe, healthy, and proud of his father, James replied without hesitation. Everything else is secondary to that goal. As Isabella watched James return to coordinating the evening's final details, she realized she was witnessing something she'd never seen before. Love expressed through duty rather than emotion. Strength demonstrated through service rather than domination. For the first time in her adult life, she felt small, not because someone had diminished her, but because someone had revealed the poverty of her own character through their quiet dignity. Isabella found herself observing James more carefully, not to identify weaknesses she could exploit, but to comprehend the source of his unshakable composure. She noticed how he thanked the kitchen staff for every meal, how he helped Maria when her arthritis made certain tasks difficult, how he coordinated repairs and maintenance with the same attention he gave security protocols. More unsettling, she began noticing her own behavior through what she imagined might be his perspective. The casual rudeness she'd always justified as maintaining high standards started feeling petty and unnecessary. The elaborate schemes she'd devised to test people's loyalty felt cruel rather than clever. The constant, low-level hostility she maintained toward everyone around her seemed exhausting rather than empowering. Maria, with the bluntness of someone who'd worked in the house for 15 years, observed that Isabella was different lately. The same person who had driven away 36 previous employees would have destroyed James by now, or at least made him miserable. But Isabella wasn't trying so hard to hurt him anymore. The observation troubled Isabella because it was accurate. Somewhere along the way, destroying James had stopped feeling like entertainment and started feeling like loss. She couldn't articulate what she would be losing, but the prospect of his departure had begun to create anxiety rather than anticipation. Tommy's first visit to the mansion transformed Isabella's perspective. She watched from an upstairs window as James's Honda Civic pulled through the estate gates, trying to see her world of privilege through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy from Queens. She noted how the limestone facade and perfectly manicured grounds must appear to someone for whom luxury was theoretical rather than routine. Tommy emerged from the car, clutching his father's hand, his eyes wide as he took in the fountain that cost more than his school's annual budget, the gardens that required a full-time staff to maintain, the garage that housed cars worth more than most people's homes. His gap-toothed grin is visible, even from Isabella's distant perch, as he declared that his father worked in a real castle. Isabella found herself drawn downstairs by curiosity about this child who commanded such devotion from a man she couldn't break. When she offered to give Tommy a tour, she saw her childhood home transform through his wonder. The crystal chandelier became a source of rainbow patterns on the ceiling. The marble floors created echoes that delighted him. The oil paintings depicted adventures in countries he'd only seen in books. In the library, surrounded by thousands of leather-bound volumes and priceless first editions, Tommy asked if she lived in all this space alone. When Isabella confirmed that she shared the mansion only with her father during his infrequent visits home, Tommy observed with the casual wisdom of childhood that it must be very lonely. Their apartment was really small, he explained, but he and his dad were always together, so it felt full rather than empty. The comparison was devastating because it was true. Isabella looked around the library with its reading chairs that cost more than most cars, its climate-controlled environment that preserved books she'd never read, its carefully maintained perfection that existed primarily for display rather than use. Tommy was right. It was beautiful and empty, impressive and lonely. During their walk through the gardens, Tommy was fascinated by everything from the greenhouse to the tennis court to the pool that remained heated even in winter. But what captured his attention most was the garden's small memorial area, where Isabella's mother was buried beneath a simple marble stone that seemed modest compared to the mansion's other displays of wealth. Tommy mentioned that his mother was buried in Queens, and that he and his father visited every Sunday after church. They told her about their week and brought flowers when they could afford them. His matter-of-fact acceptance of death and loss, combined with his ongoing relationship with his mother's memory, made Isabella realize she hadn't visited her own mother's grave in over a year. When Tommy suggested that maybe she should visit more often because moms like to know how their kids are doing even after they're gone, Isabella felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed since her mother's death. After they left, Isabella sat in the library surrounded by books she'd never read, thinking about Tommy's gap-toothed wisdom and wondering when she'd stopped believing that doing nice things was possible for someone like her. Isabella's evening encounters with James shifted from hostile confrontations to actual conversations, usually occurring when he finished his security rounds and found her reading in the library. The transition happened gradually, neither of them acknowledging the change directly, but both recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. Their conversations started with superficial topics: the books Isabella was reading, current events, observations about the household routine. But gradually they deepened into more personal territory as James shared memories of his wife Sarah and the challenges of single parenthood, while Isabella found herself revealing the loneliness of growing up in a house full of staff but empty of genuine affection. James talked about Sarah's philosophy that love wasn't a feeling, but a series of choices you made every day, choosing patience over frustration, understanding over judgment, hope over fear. The concept was revolutionary to Isabella, who'd spent her life believing that character was fixed, that people were either good or bad without possibility of change. The idea that goodness was a practice rather than an inherent trait offered hope she'd never dared to consider. Isabella began to realize she was falling in love with James Miller, not the desperate, possessive obsession she'd experienced with previous romantic interests, but something deeper and more unsettling. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, paying attention to his preferences and concerns, wanting to be worthy of his quiet respect. The feelings terrified her because they existed outside her usual framework of control and manipulation. She couldn't buy James's affection with expensive gifts or demand his attention through emotional tantrums. She couldn't leverage her social connections to impress him or use her father's business relationships to create obligations. Most unsettling of all, she couldn't even be certain her feelings were reciprocated because James treated her with the same steady kindness he showed everyone else. Isabella approached the topic of James's potential interest in romantic companionship indirectly, suggesting that Tommy might benefit from having a mother figure in his life, that James deserved happiness after years of focusing solely on his son's needs. James's response was careful but clear. Tommy had plenty of love in his life, and loneliness wasn't a good reason to complicate two people's existence. When Isabella pressed further, asking about what he might want for himself, James deflected by pointing out that she seemed to be asking about something more specific than general philosophical discussion. The gentle rejection stung more than any cruelty she'd ever endured, but it also forced Isabella to examine her motivations honestly. Was she attracted to James because of who he was as a person, or because he represented escape from who she'd been? The question would haunt her for weeks as she tried to untangle genuine feelings from the desire for transformation. Devastating news tested everything Isabella thought she understood about herself and the people around her. Tommy collapsed during a soccer game at school, rushed to Manhattan Children's Hospital with symptoms that turned routine athletic activity into a medical emergency. The call came while Isabella was reviewing charity board proposals in her father's study, and she was in her car before the doctor finished explaining the situation. She found James in the pediatric ward waiting room, his usual composure completely shattered. He looked older, smaller, utterly human in his terror as he waited for test results that might determine his son's future. The man who had weathered months of her psychological abuse without breaking was falling apart at the possibility that something might be wrong with Tommy. Isabella's immediate response surprised everyone, including herself. Without considering the implications or calculating the advantages, she offered whatever resources might be needed: money for treatment, time off work, access to specialists, anything that might help Tommy recover. When James protested that he couldn't accept such help, Isabella cut him off with uncharacteristic sharpness, pointing out that this wasn't about him or his pride, but about an 8-year-old boy who might be seriously ill. The following days brought confirmation of the devastating diagnosis: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, caught early, but requiring immediate and aggressive treatment. Isabella threw herself into coordination with an intensity that surprised everyone who knew her. Using her father's connections to ensure Tommy had access to the best pediatric oncologists in the city, arranging for private hospital rooms and specialized care that would normally require months of waiting. During the long hours spent in hospital waiting rooms while Tommy underwent testing and treatment, Isabella began to understand what love looked like when it was stripped of convenience and comfort. She watched James struggle to maintain his composure while receiving information about chemotherapy and prognosis, saw him sleep in uncomfortable chairs beside his son's bed, observed him navigate complex medical terminology while maintaining optimism for Tommy's benefit. These moments revealed a completely different person than the composed professional she'd been battling for months. With his son's life in danger, James's careful boundaries dissolved, showing Isabella the depth of fear and devotion that normally remained hidden beneath his steady exterior. Tommy's treatment progressed through the spring with encouraging results, his natural resilience carrying him through chemotherapy cycles with remarkable grace. Isabella found herself spending more time at the hospital than at the mansion, reading to Tommy when he was awake, coordinating with nurses when he slept, providing whatever support James needed during the most terrifying period of his life. During one afternoon break between treatment cycles, Tommy asked why Isabella came to the hospital every day when she surely had more important things to do. His question forced Isabella to examine motivations she didn't fully understand herself. She tried to explain that she came because she cared about him and his father, because family took care of each other during difficult times. When Tommy asked if that meant they were family now, Isabella felt her throat tighten with emotions she couldn't name. His gap-toothed grin as he declared that families stick together when things are scary became one of the most precious moments of her adult life. As Tommy's treatment showed encouraging results, Isabella began to recognize feelings that went beyond friendship or protective affection. She was in love with James Miller, deeply, completely, in a way that made her want to be worthy of his respect and Tommy's trust. But more than that, she was in love with the person she became around them. Patient instead of demanding, thoughtful instead of impulsive, generous in ways that had nothing to do with money. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying because it existed completely outside her previous experience with relationships based on social compatibility and mutual advantage. What she felt for James was based on respect for who he was as a person, admiration for his character and values, and deep appreciation for the way he'd helped her become someone she actually liked. With Tommy's most encouraging test results yet, clear signs that the cancer was responding well to treatment, Isabella decided to act on her feelings. They were in the hospital parking garage after receiving the good news, both emotionally drained from months of medical terminology and cautious hope. Isabella's confession came out in a rush of words she'd been rehearsing for weeks. She told James that she was in love with him, that she knew the timing was terrible and their situations were complicated, but that she needed him to know her feelings went far beyond gratitude or friendship. She spoke about wanting to choose him and Tommy every day the way he chose his son, about building the family they'd become during hospital visits and recovery days. James's response was gentle but devastating. He thanked her for trusting him with something so personal, but explained that what she was feeling wasn't love. It was gratitude and affection intensified by the stress of Tommy's illness. The intense experience had created confused emotions that she was mistaking for romantic love. When Isabella protested that she knew the difference between gratitude and genuine feeling, James took her hand with gentle finality and explained that even if her emotions were real, they came from completely different worlds. She was Richard Rothschild's daughter, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, with opportunities and expectations he couldn't even imagine. He was a single father working security for her family, and that gap couldn't be bridged by feelings alone. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Isabella arguing passionately against every practical concern James raised, and James gently but firmly maintaining his position that their differences were insurmountable. The rejection was delivered with such kindness that it hurt more than any cruelty could have, because it forced Isabella to confront the reality that her feelings alone weren't enough to overcome the obstacles James perceived. That night, Isabella lay awake in her beautiful empty bedroom, replaying every word of their conversation and trying to understand how something that felt so right to her could seem so impossible to James. She thought about all the relationships she'd observed over the years, superficial connections based on social compatibility and mutual benefit, transactions disguised as affection, performances masquerading as intimacy. What she felt for James was different from all of those experiences. But as the days passed and James maintained professional distance while continuing to be unfailingly kind regarding Tommy's care, Isabella began to understand that her feelings alone weren't enough to bridge the gap he perceived between their worlds. Tommy's final round of chemotherapy brought the news that his cancer was in complete remission. The celebration at the hospital was subdued but deeply felt. Doctors cautiously optimistic, James quietly tearful with relief, Tommy already planning his return to baseball season. Isabella felt included in their joy, while simultaneously recognizing that the medical crisis that had brought them together was ending, and with it, her natural role in their lives. The conversation Isabella had been dreading came gently, with James establishing boundaries now that Tommy's health was no longer in question. He explained that Tommy would return to normal school activities, that he would be transitioning to a new position that offered better advancement opportunities and a more stable schedule for his son's routine. Isabella recognized the careful preparation for departure in his words, the way he was beginning to separate their lives now that the emergency was over. When she pressed him about the change, James acknowledged that their situation had become complicated in ways that weren't sustainable long-term. The final conversation between Isabella and James took place in the mansion's library on a warm evening, surrounded by books that had witnessed the evolution of their relationship from hostility through friendship to something neither of them could quite name. James spoke carefully about the growth Isabella had shown over the past year, the remarkable changes in her character and behavior that had transformed her from someone destructive into someone genuinely caring. But he also explained that those changes had occurred in a very controlled environment, while she lived in a mansion with unlimited resources and staff handling every practical detail of her existence. She'd never had to test her new values against real hardship, real scarcity, real consequence. When Isabella protested that she was capable of handling real life, James replied that he believed she was capable of anything she set her mind to. But he also thought she had no idea what real life actually looked like for people like him, and he wouldn't be responsible for her disillusionment when she discovered that love didn't pay rent or provide health insurance. The conversation ended with James's gentle but firm insistence that their different circumstances represented unbridgeable practical realities, and Isabella's reluctant acceptance that his decision was final. As they said goodnight for what both understood would be the last time as friends, Isabella realized she was experiencing something she'd never felt before, the complete failure of wealth to provide what she most wanted. James's formal resignation and departure from the Rothschild estate followed. His replacement was competent but impersonal, maintaining the security systems James had established, but lacking the quiet dignity that had transformed the household atmosphere. Isabella found herself missing not just James personally, but the person she'd been able to become in his presence. Isabella spent the anniversary of James's arrival reflecting on the transformation that had taken place in her understanding of relationships, responsibility, and love. She began volunteering with the foundation that provided support services to single parents facing medical crises, using her privilege and connections to help people in situations similar to what James and Tommy had experienced. The work was challenging in ways that her previous charitable involvement had never been, requiring genuine engagement with people's problems rather than simply writing checks or attending fundraising galas. But it was also deeply satisfying, offering Isabella a sense of purpose that existed independently of her wealth or social position. A Christmas card arrived, addressed in Tommy's careful handwriting, containing a photo of him and James at a baseball game, both grinning with gap-toothed smiles that made Isabella's chest tight with affection and loss. On the back, Tommy had written, "Thank you for teaching me that families can have all different shapes. Love, Tommy and Dad." Isabella placed the photo on her desk at the foundation office, where it served as a daily reminder of what she learned about love during those months of hospital visits and evening conversations. James had been right about love being a series of daily choices, and Isabella was finally learning to make choices based on other people's needs rather than her own desires. Sometimes, late at night in her smaller apartment across town, she'd moved out of the mansion shortly after James left. Isabella thought about him and Tommy and wondered if they were happy, if Tommy remained healthy, if James had found someone who could love them both without complicating their carefully constructed stability. The thoughts brought sadness but also genuine hope. Isabella discovered she wanted them to be happy, even if that happiness didn't include her, a realization that marked perhaps the most significant change in her character. For the first time in her life, she was capable of loving someone enough to let them go. On quiet evenings, when her work at the foundation was particularly challenging, when she encountered families struggling with medical bills and insurance complications, and the thousand daily difficulties that accompanied serious illness, Isabella would remember James's words about love being daily choices rather than feelings. She was learning to choose service over selfishness, patience over frustration, hope over despair. The lessons weren't always easy to apply. There were days when her old patterns of thinking reasserted themselves, when she caught herself trying to solve problems with money rather than understanding, when the impulse to control outcomes through wealth and influence felt stronger than her commitment to respecting other people's autonomy. But those moments became less frequent as Isabella developed new habits of thought and behavior, as she practiced the kind of love James had tried to teach her, love that honored the other person's right to make their own choices, even when those choices caused pain. Isabella received an invitation that surprised her. Tommy was turning 10, and he wanted to celebrate his birthday at the mansion again. The request came through a formal note from James, carefully worded to avoid presumption, while acknowledging Tommy's specific wish to return to the place where he'd felt most like family. Isabella agreed immediately, understanding that this might be her last opportunity to see them both. She coordinated a small celebration in the garden. Nothing elaborate, but everything perfect for a 10-year-old boy who still believed in the magic of castles and the importance of being surrounded by people who loved him. During the party, as Isabella watched Tommy play with his school friends in the same garden where she'd once learned to see wonder instead of entitlement, she realized how much had changed since that first Christmas visit. She was no longer the person who'd taken pleasure in destroying others, no longer someone who measured her worth by her ability to control and manipulate. More importantly, she was no longer someone who needed to possess what she loved. Watching James's quiet contentment as he supervised his son's celebration, Isabella felt genuine happiness for their well-being that existed independently of her own desires or disappointments. As the party wound down and guests prepared to leave, Tommy approached Isabella with the serious expression he wore when discussing important matters. "Miss Isabella," he said, "Dad told me you help other kids now whose moms or dads get sick like I did. You try to help their families. That's good. You're really good at taking care of people." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Dad says sometimes people have to love each other from far away, but that doesn't make the love smaller." The wisdom of it took Isabella's breath away. At 10 years old, Tommy had somehow understood something that had taken her 24 years to learn, that love wasn't diminished by distance or circumstance, that caring for someone sometimes meant accepting limitations that couldn't be overcome through want or effort. "Your dad is very wise," Isabella managed. "He learned it from my mom," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "She told him that before she died, and now he's teaching it to me." As Isabella watched Tommy run back to his father, she understood that she'd been given something precious. Not the romantic relationship she'd once wanted, but something perhaps more valuable. She'd learned what it meant to love without possession, to care without controlling, to find meaning in service rather than acquisition. James approached as the last guest departed, and for a moment they stood together in comfortable silence, watching Tommy collect birthday gifts and leftover cake. "Thank you for this," James said quietly. "It meant a lot to him to come back here." "It meant a lot to me, too," Isabella replied honestly. "James, I want you to know that I understand now why you made the choice you did, not just intellectually, but really understand. You were protecting all of us from something that could have been beautiful, but would ultimately have been destructive." James nodded, his gray eyes reflecting something that might have been relief. "I never doubted your capacity for understanding, Isabella. I just needed time to be sure you'd had enough experience to make that understanding real. And now I see someone who's learned to love the way Sarah tried to teach me as a daily choice to put someone else's welfare ahead of your own comfort. The acknowledgement was worth more than any declaration of romantic love could have been, because it represented recognition from someone whose opinion she'd come to value above all others. As James and Tommy prepared to leave, Isabella realized this was goodbye in a way that their previous parting hadn't been. They were both different people than they'd been a year ago, both having learned and grown from their shared experience, but also both ready to build their lives independently of each other. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Not sure she wanted to hear the answer. James was quiet for a moment. "I think we'll always be part of each other's stories," he said finally. "But sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the space to write new chapters." Isabella nodded, understanding that this was both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one relationship and the foundation for a different kind of life. Years later, Isabella was featured in a magazine article about young philanthropists making a difference in their communities. The piece focused on her work with families facing pediatric medical crises, her innovative approaches to providing support that preserved dignity while offering practical assistance. The reporter asked about her motivation for the work, about what had inspired her to focus on this particular area of need. Isabella thought about James and Tommy, about hospital waiting rooms and the sound of a little boy's laughter echoing through marble halls, about learning to love without possessing and to serve without controlling. "I learned it from someone very wise that love isn't a feeling," she told the reporter. "It's a series of choices you make every day. I'm still learning to make the right choices." The article included a photo of Isabella at the foundation office, surrounded by thank you cards from families she'd helped and photos of children who'd recovered from serious illnesses. On her desk, barely visible in the background, was a framed photo of a gap-toothed boy and his father at a baseball game. Sometimes Isabella would look at that photo and remember what Tommy had said about loving people from far away, about how distance didn't make love smaller. She discovered he was right. What she felt for James and Tommy hadn't diminished with time or separation, but it had transformed into something sustainable and peaceful. She no longer woke up each morning with the ache of wanting something she couldn't have. Instead, she woke up grateful for what she'd learned, for the person she'd become, for the opportunity to use her advantages in service of others rather than simply for her own pleasure. On quiet evenings in her modest apartment, Isabella would sometimes allow herself to imagine James and Tommy's life continuing somewhere across the city. She pictured Tommy growing taller, maybe playing baseball again, certainly maintaining the gap-toothed grin that had taught her about unconditional love. She imagined James finding someone who could appreciate his quiet strength without needing to possess it, someone who could love Tommy without trying to replace his mother's memory. These thoughts brought contentment rather than sadness because Isabella had finally learned the difference between love and possession, between caring for someone and needing them for yourself. Years later, she would tell people that the most important lesson of her life had come from a single father and his 8-year-old son who taught her that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. She would speak about the difference between charity that creates dependency and support that empowers autonomy, about the importance of seeing people's dignity even when they need help. But she never told anyone about the champagne flute that shattered against marble floors, or about the man who looked her in the eyes and told her that money couldn't buy what she was really looking for. Some stories were too precious to share, too foundational to risk diminishing through retelling. Isabella Rothschild had learned to love without possessing, to serve without controlling, to find meaning in other people's happiness rather than her own immediate desires. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself at 23, but it was a life that allowed her to sleep peacefully and wake up grateful. And sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, she would remember a little boy's voice saying that families could have all different shapes, and she would smile at the truth of it. Love, she discovered, was indeed a series of daily choices, and she was finally learning to make the right ones. The story of Isabella, James, and Tommy delivers a profound life lesson. True love is a daily choice rooted in selflessness, not possession, and it has the power to transform even the hardest hearts. Isabella, once a master of manipulation, wielding her wealth like a weapon, learns through James's quiet strength and Tommy's innocent wisdom that love isn't about control or entitlement. It's about choosing others' well-being over personal desires. James's unwavering devotion to his son, even amidst Isabella's cruelty and his gentle refusal of her love due to their unbridgeable worlds, reveal that real love respects boundaries and prioritizes dignity. Isabella's journey from a destructive heiress to a compassionate philanthropist, sparked by Tommy's cancer battle, and James's philosophy of love as action, shows that personal growth comes from embracing vulnerability and serving others without expectation. This tale urges us to reflect on the choices we make in our relationships. Do we seek to control or do we uplift? It's a call to practice love through patience, sacrifice, and respect, even when it means letting go. Please share your story in the comments below. When have you chosen love over control or learned to let go for someone's sake? Your experiences light up this community. If Isabella and James's journey stirred your heart, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of transformation and hope. Let's inspire each other to make love a daily choice that changes lives. Subscribe now and be part of our mission to spread compassion and courage.